used to think we had it all: love, trust, and years of memories together. My wife and I were the kind of couple people admired. Friends would often comment on how well we complemented each other, and even strangers would occasionally mention how lucky we seemed. For me, it wasn't just a facade. I truly believed we were happy, and I thought she felt the same. Our relationship started out as a fairy tale. We met through mutual friends, and from the very first conversation, there was this undeniable spark. Over the years, we built a life together. We shared dreams, celebrated milestones, and leaned on each other through challenges. Sure, we had disagreements like any couple does, but nothing that ever made me doubt the foundation of what we had. She was my partner in every sense of the word. We talked about everything: our goals, our fears, even the trivial details of our day. We had inside jokes that no one else understood and rituals that were uniquely ours. Sunday mornings were for sleeping in and pancakes, and Friday nights were reserved for movie marathons. It was a rhythm we'd fallen into effortlessly, and I cherished every part of it. So when she mentioned the idea of a girls' trip, I didn't hesitate to support her. She'd been talking about wanting to take a break for a while. Between work stress and the usual grind of life, I figured she deserved it. She had always been the kind of person who put everyone else first: her family, her friends, me. This trip was an opportunity for her to relax and recharge. I remember the night she brought it up. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and she casually mentioned that her friends were planning a trip. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a few days at a beach resort, but her face lit up as she described it. I couldn't say no to that smile. "You should go," I told her without a second thought. "It'll be good for you." The days leading up to her trip felt normal. If anything, I was more excited for her than she seemed to be. I helped her pick out outfits, booked her a cab to the airport, and made sure everything was set. It didn't feel like a big deal, just another small way I could show her I cared. The morning she left, I kissed her goodbye and wished her a good time. There wasn't a single part of me that felt uneasy. I trusted her completely, the kind of trust that takes years to build and feels unshakable. Watching her walk out the door with her suitcase, I felt nothing but love and pride. For the next few days, I went about my routine as usual. We texted here and there, and she even sent me a couple of photos of the resort. She looked happy, relaxed, exactly what I'd hoped for when I encouraged her to go. If anything seemed off, I didn't notice. I didn't look for signs because I didn't think there were any to find. That's the thing about trust. It blinds you to possibilities you never want to imagine. I wasn't naive, but I wasn't paranoid either. To me, there was no reason to suspect anything. She was my wife, my best friend, and I believed in her. Yes, I lived in there. Even when she didn't call as often as I thought she might, I didn't overthink it. I figured she was just caught up in the excitement of the trip, spending time with her friends and enjoying the break. I didn't want to be the kind of partner who hovered or made her feel guilty for being away. Instead, I focused on keeping things steady at home. I took care of the little things she normally handled, made sure the house was in order, and even planned a nice dinner for the night she got back. I wanted her to feel like everything was perfect, both on her trip and when she returned. When the day finally came to pick her up from the airport, I was excited. I couldn't wait to hear all about her adventures, the laughs she'd shared with her friends, and the memories she'd made. I remember standing there in the arrivals area, scanning the crowd for her face. She smiled when she saw me, and I smiled back. But looking back now, I realized there was something in her eyes I didn't recognize at the time. Maybe it was guilt or hesitation, but in that moment, I dismissed it as exhaustion. Travel can be tiring after all. We drove home in near silence, her head resting against the window. I asked her how the trip was, and she said it was great, relaxing, just what she needed. Her answers were short, but I didn't press her. I figured she'd open up once she'd had time to unwind. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I felt a sense of contentment. I thought I'd done a good thing, encouraging her to take some time for herself. I had no idea that this trip, the one I'd supported so wholeheartedly, would become the turning point in our lives. In hindsight, there were little signs, barely perceptible cracks in the facade of normalcy. But at the time, I saw nothing. I felt nothing but love for her, and I believe she felt the same for me. It never occurred to me that the foundation of trust we'd built over the years could be shaken, let alone shattered. Those days before the truth came out were the last moments of blissful ignorance I would ever experience. I didn't know it yet, but everything I thought I knew about my wife, about us, was about to change forever. When she came back from her trip, I was eager to hear all about it. I wanted to know every detail, the fun she had, the places she visited, and the memories she'd made with her friends. But something about her demeanor seemed off. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion from traveling. She looked tired, and her usually bubbly energy seemed muted. I didn't press her, though. I figured she just needed time to rest and settle back into our routine. The first few days after her return were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She was quieter than usual, and her attention seemed divided. She'd zone out during conversations, her responses delayed or distracted. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd smile and say she was just tired or that work had been stressful. On the surface, her answers made sense, but deep down, something didn't feel right. I started noticing small changes in her behavior. She was more protective of her phone, keeping it close even when she didn't usually bother with it at home. Before the trip, she'd often leave it on the counter or forget it in another room, but now it was always within arm's reach. It wasn't just the phone, either. She seemed hesitant when I asked about the trip, giving vague answers that felt rehearsed. At first, I dismissed my concerns as paranoia. After all, I had no reason to doubt her. We'd built our relationship on trust, and I didn't want to become someone who questioned her every move. But the unease in my chest grew stronger with each passing day. I started replaying moments in my head, trying to figure out if I'd missed something. Was I imagining things? Or was there really a shift in how she acted around me? Then, about a week after she returned, she came to me with a serious expression on her face. She said she needed to talk, and the way she avoided eye contact immediately put me on edge. My mind raced, trying to predict what she was about to say. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She told me she'd been to the doctor for a routine checkup and had tested positive for an STD. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. My initial reaction was confusion. How could this happen? Neither of us had ever had any issues like this before. The explanation she offered was shaky at best. She claimed it might have been a dormant infection from years ago, something she wasn't aware of until now. Her words didn't add up. We'd been together for years, and I couldn't understand how something like this could suddenly surface. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that what she was telling me was the truth, but my gut told me otherwise. Her tone, her body language, it all felt off. There was a nervousness about her that I couldn't ignore. Why? I tried to stay calm, but my mind was spiraling. If her story was true, why hadn't this come up before? Why now, right after her trip? The timing felt too coincidental, too convenient. I began questioning everything, from the way she'd acted before leaving to how distant she'd been since coming home. Pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to see were starting to fall into place. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd told me. Every time I looked at her, doubt crept in. I started noticing more inconsistencies in her behavior. She avoided physical intimacy, something that had never been an issue between us. When I tried to bring up the topic, she'd change the subject or brush me off with excuses. The tension between us was palpable. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate this sudden shift in our relationship. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but another part of me was afraid of what I might discover. I kept hoping there was some logical explanation, something that would prove my doubts wrong, but as much as I wanted to believe her, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. It was like a tiny voice in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. I started paying closer attention to the details, how she avoided eye contact when we talked about the trip, how her phone was suddenly locked with a passcode, how she seemed restless whenever I was around. One night, as I lay awake beside her, I replayed the conversation about her doctor's visit in my head. The way she delivered the news felt rehearsed, almost like she'd been preparing herself for my reaction. It didn't feel like the genuine concern of someone who just received unexpected medical news. It felt like the deflection of someone trying to hide something. I began to wonder if I'd missed other signs before the trip. Had she been acting differently and I just hadn't noticed? Was there something in the way she'd packed her bags or the way she'd said goodbye that should have tipped me off? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The breaking point came when I noticed her texting late at night. She'd always been open about her phone, never hiding it or guarding it like a secret. But now she'd turn the screen away whenever I walked into the room, her fingers typing quickly before locking the phone and setting it face down on the table. It was a subtle change, but one I couldn't ignore. I started piecing together the little clues I'd been collecting in my mind. The distant behavior, the guarded phone, the vague explanations about her trip. It all painted a picture I didn't want to see. The trust I'd once had in her felt like it was slipping through my fingers, replaced by a sinking feeling I couldn't shake. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was piling up. I began to question everything I thought I knew about her, about us. Was it possible that the woman I loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was hiding something from me? And if she was, what did that mean for our future? Each day the tension in our home grew thicker. Conversations became shorter, smiles more forced. It felt like we were living in two different worlds. Her, carrying a secret she didn't want to share, and me, trying to make sense of the cracks that had started to appear in our relationship. I didn't know it yet, but the truth was closer than I realized. And when it finally came out, it would change everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd once trusted with my whole heart. Suspicion gnawed at me every waking moment. The unease I'd felt since she returned from her trip was no longer just a passing thought. It was a constant weight in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, my mind refused to let go. I started to notice patterns that seemed too deliberate to be coincidences. Her phone was always within arm's reach, something she never used to care about before. She'd grown more distant, not just emotionally, but physically, pulling away when I tried to hug her or touch her. The excuses she gave felt rehearsed, almost like she'd been preparing for these moments. It wasn't just her actions, though it was the energy between us. The warmth and familiarity that had defined our relationship felt like it had been replaced by a wall I couldn't see but could feel. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things. I told myself that the stress of her trip or the news of the STD might be weighing on her more than I realized. I even blamed myself for not being more supportive, wondering if I'd done something to push her away. But deep down, I knew the problem wasn't me. The changes I saw in her weren't the kind that came from stress or exhaustion. They were the kind that came from guilt. One night, while she was in the shower, I saw her phone sitting on the kitchen counter. It was unlocked, and the screen lit up with a notification from a messaging app I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I picked it up, torn between respecting her privacy and confirming the suspicions that had been eating away at me. What I saw confirmed everything I feared. The message was from an unsaved number, but the tone was unmistakably intimate. My hands shook as I scrolled through the conversation, reading texts that left no doubt in my mind about what had happened on her trip. There were photos, too. Pictures of her with a man I didn't recognize, smiling in ways that made my stomach turn. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. How could she do this? Was it a one-time thing, or had this been going on for longer than I realized? Did she feel even a shred of guilt, Or had she justified her actions in some twisted way? When she came out of the shower, I couldn't look at her. I felt like I was staring at a stranger, someone I didn't know anymore. She asked if everything was okay, and her voice sounded so casual, so normal, that it made me sick. How could she stand there and pretend like nothing was wrong while carrying this secret? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment from the past few weeks. I thought about the way she'd smiled at me when I picked her up from the airport, the way she'd reassured me when she told me about the STD, the way she'd acted as if our life together was still intact. It felt like every memory I had of her was tainted now, every moment of trust shattered by what I'd discovered. The next day, I decided I needed more proof. Part of me still clung to the hope that there was some explanation, something that could make this all make sense. I went through our phone bill and noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There were dozens of calls and texts to the same number, all during the time she was on her trip. Some of them were late at night, hours when she should have been asleep. My heart sank as I realized the full extent of her betrayal. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, it was deliberate. She had made a choice over and over again to lie to me, to betray me, to risk everything we had built together for something fleeting. I confronted her that evening, unable to hold back the anger and hurt that had been building inside me. I showed her the messages, the photos, the phone records. At first, she tried to deny it, her voice trembling as she insisted it wasn't what it looked like. But when I pressed her, when I refused to let her deflect or make excuses, she finally broke down and admitted the truth. She told me she had met him on the trip, that it had been a whirlwind of excitement and temptation. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen, that it wasn't planned. But her words felt hollow. How could she say it wasn't planned when there were messages arranging their meetings, photos documenting their time together? Her tears did nothing to ease my pain. If anything, they made it worse, because they felt like they were for her, not for me. I listened as she tried to explain, tried to justify her actions in a way that made her seem like the victim of her own choices. She said she was sorry, that it didn't mean anything, that she still loved me. But how could I believe her? How could I trust anything she said when she had already proven she was capable of such a profound betrayal? The hurt I felt in that moment was indescribable. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the lies, the deception, the complete disregard for my feelings. She had taken something sacred and turned it into a lie, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive her for that. That night, as she cried herself to sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling once again, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave her and never look back. But another part of me wanted answers, closure, something that could help me make sense of the chaos she had unleashed in my life. I knew one thing for certain: our relationship would never be the same. The trust we had built over years of love and commitment was gone, shattered by her actions. And as much as I wanted to believe in second chances, I couldn't ignore the pain she had caused or the damage she had done. The days after her confession were some of the most emotionally draining moments of my life. I couldn't think straight. My mind was a chaotic mess, replaying everything she had said and done, every red flag I had missed, every moment I had trusted her implicitly. The betrayal was suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of anger, sadness, and disbelief, unable to catch my breath. She tried to reach out to me, to apologize, to explain herself further, but I couldn't bear to look at her. Every word that came out of her mouth felt like an insult, a reminder of how easily she had broken the promises we had made to each other. I avoided her as much as possible, burying myself in work, running errands, or sitting alone in my car just to escape the suffocating atmosphere of our home. She went through all manner of terrible things to ruin a young child, from spouting that a young woman was beautiful to butchering that a young woman was dirty. Despite my efforts to distract myself, the thoughts followed me everywhere. I couldn't stop wondering about the man she had cheated with. Who was he? What kind of person knowingly got involved with someone who was married? Did he even know about me? Did he care? The idea of her being with someone else, sharing the intimacy that was supposed to be ours alone, was unbearable. Every detail I uncovered about her betrayal made it harder to function. I would stare at the phone records, at the timestamps of their conversations, imagining what they had talked about. I would scroll through the messages I had found, dissecting every word, every emoji, trying to understand what she had felt when she was with him. It was like self-inflicted torture, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know everything, even though every new discovery felt like another knife in my chest. What hurt the most was the realization that she had been living a double life, even if only for a short time. While I had been here, missing her, counting down the days until she came home, she had been with him, creating memories she would never share with me. It was as if she had taken a part of our relationship and given it to someone else, leaving me with the broken pieces. In the midst of my pain, I knew I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't let her walk away from this without understanding the full impact of what she had done. I needed her to feel even a fraction of the hurt she had caused me. I wanted her to see the consequences of her actions, to understand that she couldn't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. That's when the idea of revenge began to take shape in my mind. At first it was just a fleeting thought, something I dismissed as petty or vindictive. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way to regain a sense of control. She had taken so much from me, my trust, my peace of mind, my sense of security, and I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. I started planning carefully, methodically. I didn't want to act out of pure rage and risk doing something I would regret later. Instead, I focused on finding a way to expose her betrayal in a way that would leave no room for excuses or denials. I wanted her to see, in no uncertain terms, the damage she had caused. The first step was gathering evidence. I saved screenshots of the messages, the photos, the call logs, anything that could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what had happened. I didn't want her to be able to twist the narrative or downplay the seriousness of her actions. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, not just to me, but to anyone who might try to defend her. Once I had everything I needed, I began to think about how to confront her in a way that would make her understand the depth of my pain. I didn't want to just yell or argue. I wanted her to see the consequences of her actions laid out before her, to feel the weight of her choices as heavily as I had felt them. I started dropping subtle hints that I knew more than I was letting on. I would mention things about her trip in passing, watching her reaction carefully. Every time she hesitated or stumbled over her words, it only confirmed what I already knew. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at me whenever I brought up anything remotely related to the trip. As the tension in our home grew, so did my resolve. I was no longer content to sit back and let her control the narrative. I wanted to take back my power, to show her that I wasn't the fool she had taken me for. The idea of revenge wasn't just about hurting her. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my sense of self-worth. I began to distance myself from her emotionally, putting up walls to protect what little was left of my heart. She noticed the change, of course, and tried to reach out, to mend the rift between us. But her efforts felt hollow, insincere. How could she expect me to trust her again when she had betrayed me so completely? In the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder if revenge would truly bring me the closure I needed. Part of me feared that it would only deepen the pain, that it would make me into someone I didn't want to be. But another part of me, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, felt like I had no other choice. As the days turned into weeks, I became more determined than ever to follow through with my plan. I told myself that this wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for myself, about showing her that actions have consequences. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. Not after everything she had put me through. Looking back, I can't say for certain if revenge was the right path, but in those moments, it felt like the only way to make sense of the chaos she had brought into my life. It felt like the only way to regain a sense of control, to take back the power she had stolen from me. And as I prepared to confront her with the truth, I knew one thing for sure: our relationship would never be the same again. It felt like the only way to make sense of the chaos. The moment I decided to execute my plan was the first time I felt a sliver of clarity since discovering her betrayal. My emotions had been a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion, but this decision gave me focus. It wasn't about being petty or cruel. It was about justice, about showing her that what she had done wasn't something she could walk away from unscathed. I needed her to feel the weight of her actions, the way I had felt the weight of her betrayal. I began putting everything into motion with meticulous precision. Every detail of the plan was carefully thought out. I wasn't going to rush into it or act impulsively. This needed to be perfect. The first step was making copies of all the evidence I had gathered: her messages, the photos, and the call logs. I created a folder on my computer, neatly organizing everything in case I needed it later. It was a painful process, forcing myself to confront the reality of her infidelity again and again, but it strengthened my resolve. Next, I started thinking about how to expose her betrayal in the most impactful way. I didn't want to create a public spectacle. This wasn't about humiliating her for the sake of it. It was about making her face the truth, about confronting her with the reality she had tried so hard to hide. I decided to organize a small gathering at our house, inviting a few close friends and family members. She had no idea what I was planning. As far as she knew, it was just a casual get-together to reconnect with people we hadn't seen in a while. In the days leading up to the gathering, I played my role perfectly. I acted as if everything was fine, as if I was starting to move past what had happened. It was exhausting, pretending that I wasn't still seething with anger and hurt, but it was necessary. If she suspected anything, my plan would fall apart before it even began. The day of the gathering arrived, and I went through the motions with a calm exterior that belied the storm raging inside me. Our friends and family trickled in, laughing and chatting as if nothing was wrong. She was her usual charming self, greeting everyone with a smile and acting like the perfect hostess. Watching her was almost surreal, knowing what I knew, knowing that the image she presented to the world was a lie. When everyone was settled, I stood up and thanked them for coming. I told them I had something important to share, something that had been weighing on me for a while. The room grew quiet, and I could feel her eyes on me, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. I took a deep breath and began. I started by talking about trust, about how it's the foundation of any relationship, whether it's between friends, family, or partners. I spoke about the importance of honesty, about how betrayal can shatter not just the relationship itself, but the person who trusted blindly. As I spoke, I could see the confusion on her face, turning into something else: fear. But then, without naming names or pointing fingers, I began to share the story of what had happened. I described the betrayal in detail, laying out the timeline of events, the lies, the discovery of the messages. I could see the color draining from her face as she realized where this was going. She looked around the room, her panic evident as our friends and family listened in stunned silence. Finally, I revealed the evidence. I connected my laptop to the TV and displayed the messages, the photos, and the call logs for everyone to see. There was no denying it now. The proof was undeniable, and the silence in the room was deafening. She tried to defend herself, stumbling over her words as she attempted to explain, to justify her actions, but no one was buying it. The trust she had spent years building with the people in that room was gone, shattered in an instant. She begged for forgiveness, tears streaming down her face, but I remained silent. I had said everything I needed to say, and now it was her turn to face the consequences. After the gathering, the fallout was immediate. Our friends and family were shocked and disappointed, not just in her actions, but in the person they thought they knew. She tried to reach out to me, to apologize and beg for another chance, but I was done. Her tears, her promises, her declarations of love, they all felt hollow. How could I believe anything she said when she had already proven she was capable of such betrayal? The next step was ending our relationship. I filed for divorce the following week, determined to start fresh without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. It was a painful process, but it was also liberating. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was reclaiming my life, taking back control from the chaos she had created. As word of what had happened spread, I received messages of support from friends and even acquaintances who had heard about the situation. Some commended me for the way I had handled it, while others expressed their disbelief at her actions. It was bittersweet. While I appreciated their support, it was a reminder of the pain I had been through, the life I had lost. In the weeks and months that followed, I focused on rebuilding myself. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I had neglected, into spending time with people who truly cared about me. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain felt as fresh as it had on the day I discovered her betrayal. But slowly, I began to heal. Looking back, I don't regret how I handled the situation. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about standing up for myself, about refusing to let her walk away from her actions without accountability. It was about reclaiming my dignity and showing her and everyone else that betrayal has consequences. She had taken so much from me, but she hadn't taken everything. I still had my integrity, my strength, my ability to move forward. And as I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece, I realized that her betrayal, as painful as it was, didn't define me. It was a chapter in my story, but it wasn't the end. In time, I came to see her betrayal not as the end of something, but as the beginning of something new, a chance to start fresh, to build a life free of lies and deception. And for that, I was grateful.